Your absurd defiance ends here, hatchling.
The appointed time is here. Victory will be ours.
Incineration. Improbable.
The others arrived to challenge me for this realm.
Flames!
What's this? A real challenge. You've finally caught my attention.
Watch guilty crumble!
Came reliant on them. I'm not so foolish.
Watch guilty crumble!
Warrant all this pain.
Why run? What's the point?
I felt.
Hello. Today I would like to make my likely final update to my Widowhail Manaforged build. For those who are just joining me now, I will quickly go through what the build is. The build is an attribute stacking build where we stack all attributes, strength, dex, and intellect, all combining to give us lots of flat damage and percent damage. The flat damage comes from the Poised Prism Quiver alongside the Widowhail, and this flat damage is multiplied by us picking up Iron Will on the tree, which converts strength into spell power, and then using the Crown of Eyes, which takes this spell power and turns it into attack damage. And additionally, our chest the Iron Fortress is another 1.5 multiplier to this strength stat. Alongside this, I am using the Cyclopean Coil, which gives us percent damage on our lowest attribute, and since our lowest attribute is over 1100, this is giving us an insane amount of damage, alongside the Mastery that does the exact same thing. And now that we have the flat damage and percent increased damage out of the way, the final source of damage is crit, in which we are Inquisitor, picking up Righteous Providence, which increases our crit rating by our lowest stat of Strength and Intellect. And since we have over 1100 of each, this gives us 100% crit chance, along with having Marigaro's Virtuosity, which doubles our crit multiplier to 300. So now that we got the basics out of the way, I'll go into the changes that I made to the build for this final update. In my previous videos, the changes that I made were generally just improving the build overall. So this was switching out auras for more defensive auras, or adding Molten Shell to be tankier versus boss fight mechanics, and or creating new pathing in the tree to optimize more attributes. But none of these changes were made in this final update, as the only things that I changed was the trigger skills and supports that I'm using. So previously, in my first iteration of the build, I was proccing 11 different skills through Manaforged. In my second update, this was dropped to 10, as I linked Culling Strike into 2 of them, and again I dropped a few skills that were underperforming comparatively to other skills that scale much better with additional projectiles, since we have several additional projectiles on the build, with 2 on the tree and 3 on the quiver and bow. Additionally, we pick up additional projectiles through some alternate quality gems. So all in all, we are investing more heavily into a few skills, and those skills are Blast Rain, which we are now picking up the alt quality that gives us enemies have a chance to be covered in ash, and this is a fairly significant damage increase, since a third of our damage is fire damage, and covered in ash increases our damage by 20% for that portion of the damage. The next skill we focus on is Toxic Rain, which again, we are using an alt quality to get 2 additional arrows. And the final main skill that we're focusing on is Storm Rain, which again scales well with additional arrows. So with all these 3 skills functioning as basically overlapping skills, this is why I link them to additional damage supports, and that being Inspiration to reduce their mana, but this reduction in mana is counteracted by linking them to a 130% mana multiplier of Awaken Elemental damage with attacks. So with these 2 links, these skills are now doing roughly 64% more damage, but as you can see, they are still under the 25 mana cost of my Tornado Shot, thus they are still procced every 0.35 seconds whenever they are triggered by Tornado Shot. The next Manaforged setup was unchanged from my second update to this build, and that is Frenzy and Ensnaring Arrow are still in the build to generate Frenzy charges, and for the Ensnared Enemy debuff that Ensnaring Arrow gives, these are both linked to Culling Strike. So basically this setup is giving us roughly 15% more damage because of the Frenzy charges, 20% more damage because of the debuff, and 10% more damage because of the Culling support. So even though these skills don't do that much damage in and of themselves, they do a tremendous amount of damage for what they give the build. In my last Manaforged support is another skill that scales well with additional arrows, and that is Tornado Shot. So Tornado Shot is linked with Power Charge on crit, because this is where we're now getting our power charges, which we need since I do not have increased crit on my Bow Crucible, and since we're linking our skills with a mana multiplier, even though it's only 120, we still have to link Inspiration so that the mana cost of Tornado Shot is under our main spender of Tornado Shot. Thus, this Tornado Shot is a 4 link in and of itself. And lastly, the final link changes are to my main spender Tornado Shot. So in my previous update build, I wasn't necessarily very worried about the amount of damage that was coming out of Tornado Shot, as I was mainly focusing on it being able to trigger all 10 skills. But this has changed a little bit. As you noticed, I changed my power charge support onto my Manaforged Tornado Shot trigger, thus freeing up a slot for Tornado Shot to do more damage. Thus, now my main link Tornado Shot does a substantial amount more damage, because I can actually use some of the best damage multipliers. Thus, it is still linked with faster attacks, which is still a very strong DPS multiplier, just because a vast majority of our passive points on the Atlas tree are not allocating to attack speed, as it's pretty much just straight attributes. And since we have so much flat damage, attack speed is actually very beneficial for this build. And in addition to that, we need the attack speed to get our trigger rate to the 0.35 cooldown that our Manaforged skills have. Thus, faster attacks is very good. Next is the Trinity support, which we've always been running because it's insanely good, and it also has 140 multiplier, which we need. Next is really the only skill that isn't perfect when it comes to damage, and that is Awaken Greater Multiple Projectiles. Again, we are using this because we need the 150% mana multiplier so that we spend over 24 mana to proc all of our skills, and it's not super bad for Tornado Shot, since Tornado Shot shotguns most of its projectiles, but it's not the best because the boss has to be extremely fat for all 11 projectiles from our main Tornado Shot link to hit the boss at the same time. Thus, in general, we're typically only hitting a target with 6 or 7 of those 11 shots, but this is needed again for the trigger rate. The next one is Mirage Archer. Now, the reason I picked Mirage Archer is the same reason that I'm using Tornado Shot instead of Scourge Arrow, and that is typically in harder boss fights and or mapping, we are not necessarily shooting at the targets that we want to kill, as typically we are kiting away from harder mechanics and or AoE on the ground. Thus, even though in POB, Awakened Elemental Focus is higher sheet DPS than Mirage Archer, in reality, Mirage Archer provides us way more uptime when we get into these kiting scenarios. Thus, for example, if we're doing Ubers or an invitation boss and we have to kite around, let's say 40% of the time, and we have to trigger our skills every 0.35 seconds, if we're running away from the boss, we can still fire our Tornado Shot away from the boss, thus triggering all of our Manaforges, but also our Mirage Archer can shoot whenever he wants, thus has 100% uptime even if we're running away. Thus, in my opinion, Mirage Archer is the better support for our setup. And the final one is Awaken Elemental Damage with Attacks, and this is just a straight up good link, just like Trinity support. It has a good mana multiplier, and it gives us a lot of damage. So, now that I finished talking about all the links, I'll go through some general thoughts on it. So as you might have noticed in the clips at the beginning of the video, setting up our Manaforged triggers with more than just one link worth of damage does increase our DPS by a fairly substantial amount, at least on bosses, because of our overlapping damage on our AoE abilities of Blast Rain, Toxic Rain, and Storm Rain. But while mapping, since the mobs aren't typically super fat, thus they don't get really shotgunned by these abilities, it's in general less damage while mapping. But in saying that, we don't need more than 10 million DPS to do T16 maps before everything basically gets one shot. So even though we're doing less damage, it really doesn't matter, at least when it comes to small targets. But when it comes to bosses, we are doing roughly 30% more damage, as you saw by our 3.26 second Sirus kill. Additionally, since we took out Lightning Arrow and Ice Shot from our proc setup, we do a lot less off-screening for T16 maps, which is slightly reducing our clear speed, as we don't really have a lot of projectiles that hit the edge of the screen and or off-screen besides Tornado Shot. And even Tornado Shot, we don't have any pierce and or chain. So if you have infinitely deep pockets, what I would suggest is this final setup for all content, even for mapping, again, since we one-shot everything anyway. But instead of Awaken Multiple Projectiles in our main Tornado Shot link, I would suggest swapping out Awaken Chain when mapping, and then put back in Awaken Greater Multiple Projectiles for bossing, as this one gem switch shouldn't feel too clunky. But if you're looking to maximize both areas of content at the same time, I believe this is the simplest solution. So since this is the last video on this build, I'll give you my final thoughts on it. Overall, I think it was a smashing success. This build can be played on a low budget, as many of the uniques aren't super expensive, as in you can get a Cyclopean Coil for cheap, you can get a Maligaros for cheap. Instead of Eyes of the Great Wolf, Astromantis is still very good. You can get a low roll Iron Fortress for very cheap. Crown of Eyes is still very cheap. You don't necessarily need the additional arrow on the Poised Prism, thus that's super cheap. and getting over a 200% bow is cheap. Thus, gearing up is pretty smooth on this build. And once you gear up and get all the implicit corruptions and the extremely strong jewels, like Storm Shroud for ailment immunity, a good brutal restraint for percent dex, a large ring Thread of Hope for the super OP ranger location, a decent Watcher's Eye, and split personalities. Once you get all these, the build really pops off and does insane damage. On a conservative estimate, is doing 30 million damage, and in the top end, if the boss is really fat and all of our projectiles are hitting, does over 40 million DPS, which is more than enough for any boss, including all Ubers. Now, obviously, this build is strong for all content in the game, with a little bit of a caveat in that you will be dying on Ubers. So as I demonstrated in a previous video, 100% Delirium maps are not that hard, as long as you don't invest massively into Breach, which can be scary for almost any build on 100% Deli with the new 321 changes. It's pretty good at doing T16 maps, even though for a bow build, it's kind of slow on the movement speed portion of it. Though if you really wanted to, I'm sure you could throw in a Mage Blood into this build, as the quality of life and movement speed that a Mage Blood would give, I'm sure is worth the roughly 20% damage reduction. All the normal bosses for this build were super easy, and especially the invitations, which I completely destroyed when I got to them, and thus leaving Uber bosses. And while I've killed all the Uber bosses without failing, this build doesn't have an insane amount of defenses, with damage over time being the most deadly, since we don't have any regen in this build. Thus, if we're not hitting the target, we're pretty much going to die. So if you're strictly looking to farm Uber bosses, I wouldn't suggest this build, but other than that extremely small amount of content, this build has performed wonderfully, and I hope you guys are finding just as much success as I have. So, if you have any comments or questions, put them in the comments, and I'll get to them. Thanks.